just telling me they went.
That's how I feel.
I was like, that.
Alright. 15. Oh, okay. All right. Good morning and welcome. Thank you all for coming, and to the Zoomers, thank you for zooming in. So today we have our last seminar speaker of the semester, Dr. Tom Coleman. He is with the U.S. Forest Service, now out of Asheville, after being in California, working on invasive species out there. Did graduate school at University of Kentucky, so we're kind of all over the place. Tom has a lot of experience with forest ecology and invasive pests. And so he's going to talk to you about his experience with the Forest Service and working with other agencies and private industry. So
A little bit.
yeah, and
This
that's
is gonna
why
be different from yesterday.
that's why they were last. So I put them last.
So good morning. Thanks for coming. It's always nice to come out and talk to everybody. I especially get to share some of our recent work that we've been focusing on. A lot of what I'm going to talk about were my COVID projects that I started, and luckily I'm kind of like wrapping all that up. So yeah, I'm going to focus on the development and utilization of forest integrated pest management programs in the US. And for this work, I pulled together several of our forest entomologists and plant pathologists throughout the country to make sure that we captured all the work that we're doing out across the landscape. So if you're familiar with the Forest Service regions, I had people from the Pacific Northwest in 6, Southwest in 3, on region 9 in the Midwest, and then several of our people out of our Washington office, just because we were diving into some funding records and have this kind of national scope. And as Jess mentioned, well, I worked in 5, I've worked in 3, and now I work in 8 and 9. So we kind of cover the country pretty well. So I'm going to talk about 2 main projects. The first one is this assessment of forest IPM strategies over a 10-year period in the US. And I'll kind of wrap up with some preliminary work for the time required to develop various IPM strategies for new emerging pests. But before we get into that, let's go back and talk about some of the early days of forest pest management in the US. So going back to 1862, the USDA was formed, and there was a division of entomology in that group. And you can see in the late 1800s, some of the work we focused on was spongy moth or gypsy moth. And that was eradication efforts from Massachusetts, kind of after the first introduction. It wasn't until 1896 that Congress approved money for managing spongy moth, and that's when you kind of get all these nice pictures from back then, spraying chemicals. A lot of what they sprayed back in the day was called Paris green. It's a copper arsenic product, not very safe. Then I also did physical work, just scraping off egg masses. You see a lot of pictures like that, some of the famous pictures. But it wasn't until 1902 that the Bureau of Entomology was formed, and they had a forest program, and that's where we consider Andrew Delmar Hopkins as our father of forest entomology. And his focus was mountain pine beetle in the Black Hills, a lot of work out west. But even under the Bureau, they still focused on exotic species, also brown-tailed moth, another exotic in the Northeast. And then ultimately a quarantine was established for spongy moth in 1934. When you look at the disease side of the house, some of their earliest kind of state federal collaboration for managing pathogens was to suppress the non-native white pine blister rust. And so this is also physical work. It was mostly civilian conservation corps going out and pulling gooseberry, the alternative host, to kind of limit the pathogen. Did it work? Did not work. Of course it gets better, but it was a good effort by them. When you look out west, it's mostly bark beetles. And this was in the 20s and the 60s. Kind of the founding Western forest entomologists were Miller and Keene. This is some of their work. And they listed all the different types of management tactics they use, everything from felling, burning trees. That's your top 2 pictures on the right there. They also use something called goop. It's a mix of magnesium, asphalt, and kerosene. Safe. Insecticides at the bottom right. They even tried electrocution, radio waves, and injecting trees. They were putting some type of like preservation fluid around the poles, hoping it would take it up to prevent mostly all Western pine beetle. So it wasn't until after World War II, we had a surplus of aircraft, we had a lot of airmen returning from the war. And we also saw the development of hydrocarbon insecticides, and that was DDT. So a lot of this transition to, well, let's try treating everything from the air. And it was huge drastic increases in aerial applications. So this is Western spruce budworm patients from out west. And basically they used DDT to treat everything. And if you go back to some of the earlier publications, this insect enemies of eastern forest, this was Craig Ed. He was the second program manager of the Bureau after Hopkins. And if you look at it, basically DDT was used for everything, 1 pound per acre aerial application. So Western spruce budworm, 1 pound per acre aerial application. Spongy moth, 1 pound per acre aerial application. Forest tank caterpillar, 1 pound per acre aerial application. And ultimately, it led to millions of acres being treated for spongy moth in the 50s. And they even used 5 pounds per acre aerial application. And they're mixing it with xylene. See it clearly right there. I'm not really sure what was worse, the DDT or the xylene for that application. But ultimately, this excessive use of DDT led all these gypsy moth spray programs being included in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So this chapter 10, Indiscriminately from the Skies, talks about all the negative impacts of these spray programs where they're treating millions of acres annually. So let's move to a little bit more current forest pest management. It wasn't until 1947 that the Forest Pest Control Act was passed, and the federal government recognized the responsibility to manage insects and disease across all landscapes. And so they delegated that authority to the Forest Service, and then ultimately they gave it to my unit, Forest Health Protection. We've had many names since then. But because we cover all lands, it's why we're in state and private and now tribal forestry. So we can cross that little green line on the national forest, work with our state cooperators. And because of all the federal funding, we record all the pest management activities across all these landscapes. So our mission is to sustain healthy forests on the national forest system lands, other federal, tribal, and in cooperation with state agencies. We are directed to use integrated pest management strategies to prevent, control, suppress insect and disease issues. We're also supposed to monitor forest health conditions throughout the country, and then annually report and record our management and those forest health conditions. In that picture, that was our current day semiochemical aerial applications for spongy. So we give a great deal of funding to our cooperators to manage forest pest projects. It can be eradication, prevention, suppression, but we also give funding to our state cooperators and even our own unit to monitor the pests, do identification, provide technical assistance, and this is kind of our day job. So you can think of a lot of our positions kind of like your extension agencies. Like we go out and help support them with any of their forest health issues, but we put a lot of funding to manage. So as an entomologist, I'm required by code to show you a few insects. So mountain pine beetle, southern pine beetle, Douglas-fir tussock moth, spongy moth, invasive shot-hole borer, Symblock delgid. I'll even give you a few diseases: white pine blister rust, Parabasidian root disease, dwarf mistletoe. For the work I'm going to show you, I'm going to break it all out by feeding yields. So for the insects, I'll show you the different disease types to kind of provide a summary of what we're working on. So because we monitor the forest health conditions across the country, during this 10-year period, I want to show what was our major problem that were popping up across the country. So as far as the foliation, Western spruce budworm, that's most of what you see out west. Spongy moth in the northeast, forest tank caterpillar, yellow poplar weevil. I'm not even sure why we're mapping that, but somebody's mapping it. It's popped up, not a major issue. Fall cankerworm, spruce budworm. As far as tree mortality, it's mostly bark beetles. And you can see they pretty much dominate the western part of the U.S. You get a little bit of emerald ash borer kind of around in the east. So when you look at the impacts of insects and disease across the landscape, this actually came out of SAF, the Forest Resource newsletter a couple of months ago. Insects have a greater footprint more than wildfire. Of course, wildfire can be much more destructive as far as threats to life and property. but insects aren't doing and diseases aren't doing too bad. And when you look at the breakout from our aerial survey data, it's really comparable on an annual basis, about 0.7, 0.9%. And you compare that worldwide with some of the FAO's estimates, they estimate about 2% to pest and pathogens across the world. So what's driving a lot of our forest insect and disease issues? It's altered fire regimes and fire suppression, lack of active forest management, overstocked stands, severe drought. This is a picture from the Southern Sierra Nevadas. It's the early drought period, stressed trees, you get pine gravers coming in, killing these pockets of Jeffrey pine on the landscape. Also warmer winters and your typical kind of population oscillations, these outbreaks come in. And then also increased international trade. So this is a ship with Asian gypsy moth or flighted spongy moth complex, and we're constantly trying to prevent a lot of these new exotics, insects and disease coming in into the country. So let's talk a little bit about integrated pest management. The concept to maintain pest populations below levels that cause economic damage by using multiple tactics to conserve environmental quality. That's kind of the simplest definition I could find, but essentially we just don't want to spray DDT on everything. So you kind of go through all these strategies: monitoring, identification, education, outreach, decision-making. Now these concepts are basically defined in agricultural cropping systems. And so when they do decision-making, they have much more defined economic thresholds, economic injury levels. So if you pull a soybean leaf and you see 10 aphids, you know you got to spray if there's 15. So they have much more defined decision-making tools than what we see in the forest ecosystem. Although we have some examples out there. You move your control treatments, you evaluate effectiveness, and you do your record. So that is your general IPM kind of strategies. So here's some examples of that: education and outreach. Here's some decision-making we use in slow the spread, your monitoring, and then all your various kind of treatment management tactics. And as I mentioned, this is kind of what we call our survey and technical assistance. This is our day job. We don't really directly fund a lot of this. It's kind of what we do day to day. This is where we put most of our funding to, is the actual management of the work. So to evaluate a decade of forest IPM in the US, we kind of had 4 main objectives with this work. One was just to review forest pest management activities in the US. We've never done this with our data. You'll see publications, book chapters where they outline, if you're managing bark beetles, here's all the tactics you can use. But it's never actually been reported what we use, more so than any others. I want to know what was the frequently used IPM strategies and tactics. I also want to identify the forest pest groups and species targeted most by FHB, our unit, and our partners, and then identify the most comprehensive forest IPM program that we have in the US. So for the methods, these are pretty complex. I went into our database and I downloaded the records. I had to go in every year and download them separately and combine them, but it was pretty simple. There's a lot of error correction. Sometimes I had to match proposals with accomplishments, so it did take time. But because this is kind of just census data, database, it doesn't meet any of the assumptions of ANOVA. So it's just descriptive statistics for what I'm going to present. The one thing I left out is the invasive weed work. We do contribute to invasive weeds. I'm an entomologist, somebody else can. But this is already a big enough project. People can tackle that elsewhere. So when you look at our databases, there's 2 main ones we had during this time. Our older one was called FAD, Forest Accomplishment Database. Basically, only state and federal people that have access to this database can get in and put in records. And our current one is called For Health. You see the picture there. And this tracks all the funding we did for our management work. So it's for on federal lands, on cooperative lands. We record all this information. We also have other databases that focus on some of our specific pests. So within Slow to Spread, I have a large database. Within Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, it has a separate one. Sometimes there's a lot of these pest projects where we can't track acres treated or area treated. So I had to dive into certain reports from this group or our funding records from our Washington office for that. Now, what I'm going to talk about is only our funding from state, private, tribal forestry, not the national forest. So if you're thinking about forest health on the national forest, like prescribed fire or certain thinning treatments, not included here. That's national forest projects. So just pest-specific projects. Here's basically what can all go in the database. Luckily, it's a lot of drop-down menus, so there's not a ton of error corrections, but you still get it. You can kind of see a summary report of some of the work there. But ultimately, this is kind of what I'm going to focus on today: the year, the ownership, disturbance agent, disturbance type, primary host, treatment activity, hectares accomplished, and the IPM strategies that were used. So let's look at the results. During this 10-year period, there was over 2,400 pest projects, and we treated over 2.2 million hectares. That represents about 3% of the total forested area in the U.S. We treated 78 different taxa of forest pests, but ultimately, when you kind of narrow it down, 20 taxa comprise 98% of the treatment areas. We focus on a handful of issues for most of our work. When you look at the hosts we're treating, there was 53. But 18 represent 99% of the data. If you whittle it down a little bit more, 4 represent 95% of our treatment area. So oak, loblolly pine, ponderosa pine, eastern hemlock. If you know anything about insects killing something, you can figure out what we're managing on those species. So just to show some of the examples, this is silvicultural control, tree thinning work with bark beetles, aerial applications of mating disruption for spongy moth, aerial applications of BTK microbial work, physical mechanical control, cutting infested trees for bark beetles, chemical work, bark beetle control, classical biological control, rearing for hemlock leodelgid, vegetation outreach, and then genetic control from our screening center up in Asheville. So looking at our accomplishments over this period, years across the bottom, just the number of projects on the y-axis. You can see we kind of had a dip down from the 2010s, but it's remained fairly flat. Our funding's been fairly stable over this 10-year period. There was huge mountain pine beetle outbreaks in the Rockies during the late 2010s. That was kind of the downfall of that work. But you see, most of what we're funding is suppression, a little bit of prevention, very little eradication and restoration work. So APHIS is the federal government regulatory program. They do most of the eradication. We have some agreements with them for some pests, but they handle most of that work. And we just don't have enough funding to do that much restoration. When you look at the area treated, this is hectares. Most of the work is going to suppression treatments. The next is prevention, and again, very minimal eradication and restoration, but you can kind of see a little bit of downfall in our area treated during this period. So for a lot of the figures I'm going to present, it's basically just a count of projects for this work. So when you look at ownership, where did most of this work occur? It was on National Forest System land. So 67% occurred on Forest Service. The next was cooperative lands. That's what we call state private lands. Other federal and tribal lands had a little bit, and that's basically because we only do suppression work on other federal and tribal lands, and it's just a dollar issue. We just don't have that much funding to do prevention work. And where most of this occurred, again, with the Rocky Mountains, it was that mountain pine beetle outbreak in the early kind of 2010s. It also was from the eastern and southern U.S. That's southern pine beetle, hemlock leodelgid, that's spongy moth. Those are the main driving factors here in the east. When you look at what pests we're targeting, 79% were native species. The rest is non-native, but when you look at our treatment area, invasive species account for 84% of our data. And that is mostly driven by spongy moth. You're going to hear that name a lot with a lot of our data that contributes so much to what we accomplish throughout the country. As far as the various IPM strategies, so 4 comprise 93% of the total projects. You can kind of see they're fairly split, almost quarterly with this, but the most being silvicultural projects. So prevention tree thinning for bark beetles. We think about all of our bark beetle species out west and southern pine beetle in the south. Semiochemical work. That's mostly spongy moth mating disruption, and then again our bark beetle anti-aggregate. So mountain pine beetle, Doug fir beetle, think of MCH and verbenome for that work in the western U.S. The next is chemical, mostly bark beetles, hemlock leodelgid, and emerald ash borer. And then physical and mechanical, this is where we start to see more of the diseases coming into play. So pruning, tree sanitation, and trenching for some of our disease issues. But again, semiochemical control accounted 72% of the total treatment area. Again, that was mostly spongy. So what are we treating? It's 4 meters bark beetles, 70% of our projects for that work. Fall sap beetles, rust, there's parasitic higher plants, that's your dwarf mistletoes, wilts and wood borers. That's kind of mostly the key issues we're addressing. So here I have the feeding guilds and the disease types on the x-axis, just this percentage of projects. Along across the top is just the number of projects that are out there. All the various IPM strategies. So you can see any of the ones that have multiple colors, there's more strategies we're using to help manage these pests. When you look at the diseases, it's usually relying on physical and mechanical control. We don't have a lot of options for our disease issues. A little bit of silvicultural hiding in there, but not a lot. Also, when you look at sap beeters, wood borers, and seed cone and foliage shoot diseases, it's a lot of chemical work. You'll see, even though it's all chemical, there's only 5 projects during that 10-year period, and these are all in seed orchard high value treatments. So they're trying to maintain the seed orchard. Similar type setup. This is area treated though. So again, across the top, total hectares treated in each category. See, we're getting a lot from our foliage feeders, blown feeders, sap feeders, rust, and vascular wilts, the majority of our treatment areas. Most of this is semiochemical work. It's mating disruption with microbial control as BTK applications for the most part. Silvicultural work with bark beetles. There's chemical sap feeders, that's in Lockwood Belgian, and then more kind of pruning or physically removing infected trees from sites. But ultimately, our most prominent management tactics, aerial application of mating disruption and BTK, sponging off. Prevention tree thinning, that's for bark beetles for the most part, a little bit of dwarf mistletoe, tree sanitation harvest, in diseases, soil and tree injections, emerald ash borer and Lockwood Belgian. Anti-aggregants, more bark beetles, ground applied cover spray, bark beetles, pruning infected branches, white pine blisters, most of them. So just to show you kind of what we're managing across the landscape, this is kind of representing more than 5% of the project. So in the south, southern pine beetle, spongy moth, and Lockwood Belgian. Not too much different in the east, north of us, it's add in emerald ash borer and oak wilt. When you look out west, it's bark beetles. With a little bit of dwarf mistletoe, rust thrown in there, and some root diseases. And if you're up in Alaska, you're basically managing spruce beetle. So, looking at kind of the main agents. So there was 78 that I said we focus on management. You can see kind of what's driving, but guess what? Bark beetle, foliage feeder, bark beetle, sap beetle, rust, wilt, bark beetle, wood borer, foliage feeder, bark beetle. Well, what contributes most of the work? Spongy moth, 81% of our work for that. Southern pine beetle, mountain pine beetle, hemlock wood, velvet, Douglas beetle. And then we have all the remaining agents are 2%. They don't contribute a lot to our accomplishments. And this is all of them. So everything here. So all these were less than 1,008 hectares during this 10-year period. Total 8,300 hectares. This is essentially $11 million of our funding, 5% during that time. We see a lot of dwarf mistletoe, even some true mistletoe hiding in there. And then the dreaded ants. Those are thatch ants in Oregon. It's campground treatments, they're a nuisance. So. And so again, the primary host, 53 taxa. Again, here's those top 4. Spongy moth, southern pine beetle, western pine beetle, and Lockwood Belgian. And then you see several 5-needle high elevation pines. That's blister rust, that's mountain pine beetle. See a couple of ashes in there. Emerald ash borer. Northern red oak, Texas red oak, oak wilt. They're our kind of main management. When you look at the mean project side, we already know we do a lot of semiochemical work. We do a lot of mating disruption. What helps that? So this is our new product. Instead of goop, we have splat. That's the product we spray. Our average project size is over 14,000 hectares. For the aerial applications, microbial BT, it's 2,800. For our silvicultural thinning treatments for bark beetles, 300. As they get more tedious, you can see the acre or the hectares kind of go down. So 193 for removing infested trees. Ground applied semiochemicals, this is also splat. 47, chemical and soil injections, 208, cover sprays. If you have to get a big machinery on site, you better have something developed there where you can get that in there to spray the trees. Something that also helps contribute to the cost, we get our best cost per hectare for our aerial applications. So $34 per hectare, 89, and again, as that work gets more tedious, the cost per hectare goes up. So chemical control, kind of told you a lot of the history of how much chemicals we sprayed back in the day. During this time, the total was 44,000 hectares. That doesn't sound like a lot to me. Maybe that sounds like a lot to you. But most of this work was directed at campgrounds, admin sites, or conservation areas. We're trying to manage hemlock in these little pockets before the biocontrol can get established. This was a campground spray treatment on the Angeles, Southern California. And most of what we're putting on the landscape is carbro, that's for the bark beetles. Imidacloprid, that's mostly hemlock oleodelta, and enamomethane benzoate is for emerald ash borer. And most of that work is by our state cooperators off of federal land. So they're doing that on private lands with their own state lands. Not on federal. So some of these control strategies, they're not easily tracked by area treated or acres. One of them is biological control, classical biological control. So most of our projects went to hemlock oleodelta. We had one project for mineral. And during this time, they had 832 releases of 5 different predator species to control HWA. You can see this is the map all the way from Southern Appalachians up to New England. High concentration of releases here in the Southern Appalachians. There used to be a facility here at Clemson. There's one at Georgia. There's one at UT. So they did a lot of releases. Not usually tracked by acres treated. So this doesn't actually get kind of reported up to a lot of our accomplishments, because they eventually go to Congress. As far as genetic control, another one of these. So resistant screening and breeding, gene conservation, mostly for native and non-native pathogens that we're doing. And it's mostly 2 facilities. Dorena, it's out in Oregon, the Rust Screening Center, that's our facility in Asheville. And these are probably some of the best, cooperative efforts we have. It's feds, it's states, it's private industry that send in their seedling, their seed stock to get screened for pathogens. And annually, they'll do about 180 seed lots as a service, very cheap service to these cooperators. But again, because it's not an acre equivalent, it's not very well tracked. It's the reason it's not in our system. So something we got to improve on. All right, let's talk about the most comprehensive IPM programs. IPM strategies across all the feeding guilds and disease types. Green, that's what we directly paid for in these projects. Yellow is again our survey and technical assistance. This is our day job. We do a lot of education outreach, we do identification. Everything I've talked about is because of our record keeping. We don't directly fund a lot of this work. The one thing that we can certainly probably do better is the formal assessments of evaluating the effectiveness of our treatments. We monitor it. We don't really document it that well, except a few programs. We do it in slow spread. You think about eradication treatments, we need to make sure that works. Southern pine beetle suppression work, usually they're out there checking that again to see if they need to do the treatment. So there's a handful that do have it. When you look at all the IPM strategies, the ones we see most across all pests, physical, mechanical, chemical, and silvicultural control. What we don't see a lot of, genetic control. This is all for mostly the pathogens that are out there. Decision making, I mentioned that we don't really have very good decision-making tools for some of our issues. Usually it's stand hazard ratings or individual tree assessments. We're talking about the worthless. So biological control, a lot of people think that this is the end all for forest management. We just get the biological control agent out on the landscape, we're good. We do not have a lot of really good examples of that. Basically, all of our work goes to HWA. And microbial control, well, that's BTK, that's nucleopolyhedrosis virus, the spongy moth is our main example for that. So spongy moth or other butterflies or moth species that we're treating for that. So what's our most comprehensive program? The foliage meters. And that's driven by, again, spongy moth and our work with Douglas tussock moth out west. Because they use all these varying strategies. Well, here's pretty good too. Southern pine beetle really drives this. We have great program for southern pine beetle, similar work for western pine beetle. And for wood borers, it's all the most recent work on emerald ash for that. So how do we get here? In 1970s, there was a combined forest pest research and development program. We call them the big bug programs. All these pests had huge outbreaks in the 70s. And the federal government decided to put millions of dollars to these pests for these programs, and you got these nice little books out of it. But it also developed IBM strategies that we're still using today. So the kind of seed for those projects started back in the 70s for a lot of this work. Spruce butternut was a collaboration between us and Canada, and they're treating millions of acres for spruce butternut here recently. Something else that contributes to this is all the various factors of why we're managing some of these pests. Is it a tree killer? We mostly deal with tree killers. Is it a small little pocket mortality, like a root disease center, or is it across the whole landscape, like the bark beetle outbreaks? Location, is it in a campground, or is it on the back 40 that we're not really concerned about? The treatment options, we have way more tools in our toolbox for insects than we do diseases. But ultimately, it's funding. It's like what comes down to funding. And when you look at our kind of main funding programs within forest health protection, you kind of break it out in 3 categories. Our largest funding program goes to spongy moth, the slow spread program. It includes a couple other ones as well. Southern pine beetle, western bark beetle, and Wacholea delgid, emerald ash borer, oak wilt, white pine blister rust. So of course, they're getting a lot more funding, which allows us to treat more. But we don't see that for every other little pest that's out there. So, because I said spongy moth so much and slow the spread programs, what I manage, it is one strategy of the larger strategy that goes in with eradication and detection, suppression work, and regulatory work. And this is APHIS and the state side of it. So we do cooperate with APHIS pretty close. Guess what? We've also been dealing with this pest for 150 years. And so we started these area-wide managements back in 1920 in New York, and it's evolved every time. It's kind of gone and got better, I'll say. And guess what? It's successful. Slow spread program, now the dark green boundary here, the whole reason you all don't have spongy moth influenza. Because you're slowing it 80%, our target rate is 60, and we've been doing it for over 2 decades now for this work. Another key factor about this pest, it's the only federally regulated insect we manage with APHIS. So this is the rare one we have MOU with APHIS to kind of say, okay, we manage this part, you manage that part. And it's been very effective. So keep on going. So to kind of wrap up this first part, are we meeting our forest health objectives in the US? I'm a little biased, I'm gonna say yes. We're doing the best we can. Are we managing the correct issues? I showed you kind of the whole list of our big defoliation mortality across the landscape. A lot of those same names kind of kept popping up in our work. Does it have a noticeable impact? You know, that whole list of all the extra 2% of work we manage, those are specific requests by the National Forest or our cooperators because it was impacting management objectives. It may not attribute a lot to our accomplishments, but we're helping meeting their management objectives. What do we not address? How many times did I say sudden oak death? Laurel wilt. We don't have a lot of tools for this. There's a lot of money going to sudden oak death, not a lot going to management. Are we aligning with the Forest Service priorities? We know to maintain forest health across the country, we've got to do a lot more, a lot faster. And so there's been a new push from the Forest Service for these wildfire crisis landscapes. They even added new ones now, the kind of black polygons. It's like, how much do we get involved with that work, with our forest health dollars? So National Forest is getting a lot of funding for it, we are not. But how much do we align with it? It's a new strategy. That's something we could discuss. Right. So with that, I'm going to kind of transition to the other project. So I started my career in Southern California with the Forest Service. I was out in Cleveland National Forest, talking with the resource officers about, guess what, bark beetle projects. They also kept saying, well, we have this oak mortality too. There's oak mortality, it's drought, it's oak mortality. By the way, the drought had ended several years ago. Oak mortality keeps going on, it's drought, don't worry about it. It's pretty extensive. Ultimately, if it's not drought, I linked it to a new insect, gold spotted oak borer. This is an agrylus, similar to emerald ash borer, if you think about it, lovely little D-shaped exit holes, similar larvae, feeds under the bark, girdles trees. Feels really large diameter coast live oak. That is expanding mortality out of San Diego County. So by the time we linked it to the tree mortality, it had been 10 years since we'd seen the mortality going on. So we had to answer management questions real fast for the National Forest and for the public. So we had to figure out where it was. We did all these monitoring studies, lure studies. We believe it was brought in on firewood. Now we're doing firewood management studies, so it's not moved around anymore. Chipping, grinding, solarization, biological control. Do we have any options there? Chemical control. So this all had to be answered very quickly. I was getting some extra funding from our Washington office. They also are saying, well, when's this going to end? How much more longer are you going to need? A couple $100,000. Good question. And also get out in front of the public, and they'd always say, well, when's the biocontrol going to be ready? 20 years, 10 years, if we're lucky, you know? So that kind of got me thinking. So how long does it take to develop these various IPM strategies after these new emerging issues come into play? So rapid mosquito death, sudden oak death, invasive shot oak borer, Mediterranean oak borer, here's gold spotted oak borer, beach leaf disease, emerald ash borer. And luckily, there was kind of a nice mix, kind of going back to 2000, of several insect pathogens in these pathogen complexes. That sugarberry mortality here in South Carolina also looked at. So this also is a pretty simple, straightforward method. This is a lit review. Going into the literature, seeing when they publish articles addressing management strategies for these various pests. And just to give you an idea of how many publications are out there addressing some of these, well, it's 607 for emerald ash, over 400 for sudden oak death, and your sugarberry, it's 3. So sometimes there was a lot, sometimes there was very little. But ultimately, I used 257 publications for these 10 issues for these various IPM strategies. So sometimes there was 0 for a certain pest, and sometimes there was 11 for a specific strategy. So what I wanted to do was determine the mean time needed to develop these strategies from when we linked it to injury and tree mortality. And I used our publication date. So it's not just monitoring, but we trying to identify baits or lures, we testing traps, was it a risk assessment, doing flight mill studies, post testing, chemical work, even physical, mechanical, chipping, solarization, grinding, all that, but for all. So here's some of the preliminary results. The red bar here. By the time we identify something, and people go back and start looking at anecdotal reports and doing dendrochronology studies, it's already been in the country 7 years. And that was kind of the mean time for several of these studies. So you think about emerald ash borer, they found it like in the early 2000s, they went back and did dendro work and said it's been here since the 90s. That's kind of where this is. Once we identify it, education outreach comes out very quickly, within a year. We're really good at that. You can pump that out quickly. But you gotta be careful because on average, there's 2 papers confirming or revising the species. So let me tell you what that's about. Here's Southern California again. We had an invasive ambrosia beetle introduced. It was utilization species. It was caught in a trap in Long Beach in 2003. It wasn't linked to tree injury and mortality until 2012. Somebody found it attacking their backyard avocado tree. Then we learned it loves box elder. So then it's like, oh yeah, you remember back in 2011, we lost that whole row of box elder in LA? We start to learn that, we start looking around, guess what? It's all over Southern California. And there was a second species introduced in San Diego County. So they called this T-shot borer, Utilization fornicatus. It had also been introduced in Florida. They started doing all the genetic work. No, it's not fornicatus, it's Whitford-Diodendrus Utilization. This one's Curascio. No, it's not Whitford-Diodendrus. This is fornicatus. The one in Florida is Brevis. It's another species. So it's a mess. And meanwhile, we're trying to go out to the public saying, you have this new species. It's invasive shot borer. Done. Leave it. So there's kind of issues about that trying. You see that also with the pathogen side of the world. They think it's one species, it's not, it's a new species. So here's the time to publish since we linked it to tree injury and mortality. So if you're thinking about monitoring, is it a spread or risk assessment? Looking at new detections impact host range, you're looking at 4 to 6 years before you get that information. You're looking at developing a trap or molecular tools for IDing some of the pathogens, 6 years as well. Say it's bad enough, you want to start talking about classical biological control and do some of these exploratory surveys for natural enemies, it's about 6 years out before we get that information. Chemicals, contact comes out before systemic, you're looking at 6 to almost 7 years before you get that information. Genetic work, this is kind of the resistance in some of the favored hosts, is red maple less specific or less susceptible to silver maple, something like that. Mechanical physical, this is the chipping, solarization, grinding, 6 years. You're going to try to get a bait for an insect if you're lucky to find a bait, a little over 6 years. Say you find a natural enemy, you start doing the host specificity testing. You're looking at about 8 years for that work. Semiochemicals, if you're dealing with an insect, 9 years. And if you try to pull all this together into one nice little package for an IPM program, there was one study with emerald ash borer, you're looking at about 9 to 10 years. So then add your 7 years onto it when we missed it. So 12 to 15 years before we kind of really get information after it's been in the country. So guess what? From that previous study, well, I have management information on several of these exotics. Emerald ash borer, Rapidohea, sun-oak death, gold spotted oak borer. You can see when we linked it to tree injury and mortality, the type of management we used, a lot of chemical, a lot of physical, and the years we treated. So, how many years by the time we identified it, did we put the first treatment on the ground? On average, it's about 10 years. So if you start talking about eradication, we're already way behind the 8 ball on a lot of this. And it's spread everywhere. These are ones we didn't know anything about. It's not like Asian longhorn beetle when it showed up in South Carolina. We already had all this management tactics, knew the biology, you could start that management immediately. With these, it took time to figure out, is it even worth managing or something? So when we start talking about managing these new emerging pests, I'll say we do have a framework to develop a new IPM program. You can go back to these, clove spread, southern pine beetle, tussock moth, HWA, all have really great programs out. What we lack is this collaboration, significant funding, see this additional agencies getting involved. Used to be ARS working close with the Forest Service, us with APHIS, universities, tribes, everybody for these bigger programs. So they put $10 million into these three in the 70s. That's the equivalent of $47 million today. So when these new pests arrive, guess how much money we're putting to them? You're lucky if you get 200,000 a year for something. So we're kind of nickel and diming a lot of this work, but these investments have really paid off. We're still managing these today. They contribute a lot. Guess what? Everybody in the South or the Northeast or out West made careers on these, and it trained hundreds of students that fell under it. So there is great investment in kind of putting money to these new IPM programs. And with that, I'll finish up. We had a lot more people from our side get involved with this, but thanks for inviting me out. I'll take any questions. Yeah.
This goes back to the first part that we were talking about, but you were saying that you're doing a lot with the suppression and then prevention as the 2 types of treatment. So if you're not doing like reforestation or a lot of it, are you tracking how well then like they recover on their own? And have you seen like any market increase or change to that recovery process?
Most of that would kind of be on the national forest side. So like if we're going to get involved in like restoration, some of the new dollars for southern pine beetle, the transition out of loblolly and shortleaf to longleaf pine, we put money to that. Now after some of these large scale outbreaks, depending on the area, what you're seeing is a lack of recruitment, lack of regeneration, especially out of California. maybe not so much in issues in other areas, but it's always the aftermath. It's the fuels that issue coming from that and how quickly we can get in there and manage it. Yeah.
Also talk about, it's probably a very naive question. So the spongy moth and it being a, as you say, a fairly inexpensive aerial spraying program because it's a foliage. I'm wondering if, looking back, is that to some extent a detriment to a longer term, more permanent solution for that insect? So for example, having with HWA as a borer, having to do biocontrol, maybe in the long run will be more effective.
So we've had in the early 1900s, all that was tried, like classical biological control. They released, I mean, this was before all the requirements for host testing was in play. They released 30 something species. A lot of them established, didn't really do anything. They're out there. Some have attacked other non-target species. That's where kind of the lack of control was there. The two main ones that have really contributed to it, it's the virus, this nucleopolyhedrosis virus. It was kind of brought into in the early 1900s, but it's very density dependent. So as you get these outbreaks coming in, the virus spreads and starts to kind of knock everything down. The other one is a fungus. It's Entomophica maiamiga. And so that's kind of more dependent on cool, wet springs. So any of these areas, we had a few droughts this year in the outbreak areas, and the fungus was just decimated. So those populations skyrocketed. The virus, we took and made it into a product. It's called Gypcheck. And so we spray that in areas where we have sensitive other lepidopteran species, moths and butterflies that we don't want to impact. And we use that instead of BTK. But the fungus, it's widespread. And so it's like, that is probably the best thing we have out there. So even with those pretty good natural agents, spongy moth it reaches outbreak status even in Europe and Asia. With all those natural control factors. So there is a lot of prevention work that can be done to reduce your oak basal area to kind of limit the impact of the foliation mortality. It's just like with the slow the spread program, we talked a little about it. It's like we've had so many cost benefit analysis to show it's like a 3-to-1 benefit of our cost by regulatory issues, private landowners doing insecticide treatments. It's like we can treat up these much smaller localized infestations with a safer product, the mating disruption that benefits everything. So yeah, the other techniques have been tried, but we still get the outbreaks even for the natural enemies that are out there. And the fungus, they introduced it as many times, and then just all of a sudden it popped up in the 90s. So it was kind of a weird one.
Yeah, given the cross-boundary nature of these pests, so I was just curious to know about the international collaboration in the IPM.
Our probably best one is for, guess what? Spongy moth. It is more on APHIS's side. So APHIS, Customs and Borders Patrol with Canada, with several other countries, Chile, China, Japan, Russia, all have this international monitoring program. So we're not bringing it into the US on ships. So they have monitoring programs in those countries. They see these peaks in activity. They'll tell the ships to monitor their port and kind of like scrape off egg masses as they come over. And so then like we know that data, we know when they're coming into port at these certain high risk times, and they get checked when they come in the US, Canada, some of these other countries. So that's some of the best that we have. And that's been going on. That program started in the 90s in Russia. And it's a fairly, we contribute a few tens of thousands of dollars to it, and it's worth its weight in gold for that. Any other questions? Thanks again for having me.
I know, and I did immediately.
Let's remember though that December 8th, I think it is, we have the poster session, so we'd love for everybody to come out for that as well. Yeah, you're doing. Yeah. No. Habitat. Okay. That's like more than that.
Because again, they haven't really put.
Okay. Yeah.
Eat different calories.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm